Hey everybody, it's Dr. Gilchrist and welcome to week 4 of Drugs and Behavior. Now, this is the last week where we are going to be covering 3 different chapters. So this week we are going to talk about marijuana and the cannabinoids. We're going to talk about the hallucinogens, including things like LSD, PCP, ecstasy, and so on. And then we're going to finish up by talking about inhalants, and we're going to talk about GHB and its other derivatives. So this is going to be the last week where we really go in depth covering 3 different topics. So let's go ahead and begin talking about marijuana and the different cannabinoids. So here's kind of the overview for what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. We're going to talk about the background and the history of marijuana, the basic pharmacology, the mechanisms of action, cannabis use and chronic exposure, as well as the behavioral and physiological effects. So let's go ahead and begin by talking about the history of marijuana use. So marijuana itself is produced from the flowering hemp plant, particularly the plant that is under the name Cannabis sativa. You can see it kind of looks like a weed, which is part of the reason why marijuana sometimes gets the name weed. Now, hemp historically has served a very important role in a lot of different cultures for making things like rope, cloth, even different things like paper, and the seeds of hemp have been used for oil and bird food. You can actually get hemp seed and put that in your salad. It's often a very good way of getting things like omega-3 fatty acids. But more importantly for this class, the cannabis plant contains about 70 different unique compounds. Collectively, we call those cannabinoids, as well as 400 other identified compounds. Now, the psychoactive properties, particularly delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, that's what really accounts for cannabis use. Now, the cannabinoids can basically be found in all different parts of the plant, but they tend to be more concentrated in a sticky yellow resin or resin that's secreted from the flowering tops of different female plants. So, cannabis, typically, marijuana itself is basically a mixture of things like dried stems, crumbled leaves, dried leaves, small stems, and flowering tops. And one of the things that you might be kind of interested in, if you want to increase the potency, one of the things that you want to do, because people have a lot of problems with the seeds, is basically prevent pollination. As a result, the female plants don't have any seeds, and you basically get what is referred to as sinsemilla, which literally translates to without seeds. Now, some people do consume marijuana orally. You've probably heard about marijuana being used in cookies, sometimes referred to as Toke House cookies. You've probably heard it referred to as brownies. I've heard about people who will put it in their butter or put it in their pasta. But generally, it's going to be more commonly smoked in things like rolled cigarettes, which are known as joints, different types of pipes or bongs, and additionally hollowed out cigars that are better known as blunts. Okay, so hashish is going to be another common derivative. This can either be smoked or eaten. You can kind of see it right here. Potency typically is going to depend on how it's been prepared. So in areas like the Arabian Peninsula or in Eastern Asia, hashish is going to typically refer to a pure resin that's prepared with very high cannabinoid content. It can also be used to describe solvent extract of leaves. or resin that are going to be a bit more variable. Additionally, one powerful type of hashish is called hash oil. Basically, it's an alcoholic extract that's been reduced to kind of a viscous liquid. And basically, a single drop of that hash oil is going to be placed on cigarettes, or you could add it to a joint to basically double the dose. So these are common ways that people will typically use marijuana. So we're going to talk about this a little bit in greater detail in the next couple of slides. But here you can kind of see the timeline for a very general history of cannabis use. So in 8000 before Common Era, we have the archaeological record of hemp cord, followed by medicinal use in China and potentially religious use in India. By Common Era, the Arabian Peninsula is using hashish. The Western world learns about its bioactivity in the 1850s. The Marijuana Tax Act, which was passed in 1937, but largely through propulsion by Henry Anslinger, is going to come into play. And then the first state laws that are legalizing medical use are passed in 1996. So cannabis use actually began in Central Asia, most likely China. And as I kind of showed you on the last slide, there's evidence that hemp cord was being used 8,000 years ago. Additionally, medical and religious use can be tracked to areas such as China, India, and parts of the Middle East. And then it was spread to the Arabian Peninsula, where hashish consumption became pretty common. It's actually mentioned a bit in the folk stories of the 1001 Arabian Nights. But really, it didn't spread over to the Western Hemisphere really until the mid-19th century. So Napoleon's soldiers reportedly brought hashish from Egypt back to France. And around the same time, a French physician encountered the intoxicating effects of hashish and basically found, he actually found, his last name was Moreau. He founded a notorious club of writers and artists that were called Les Clubs des Hachishins, or the Club of the Hashish Eaters. This included people like Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, and Baudelaire. Now, what about the United States? So you may be kind of surprised. Cannabis in the United States actually dates back to its colonization. Hemp was very important as a fiber. George Washington, as well as many others, farmed hemp. I quoted the book Mason and Dixon last week when we talked about coffee, and Mason and Dixon is meant to be kind of an alternative version or an alternative retelling of the colonial period. And one of the things that I always thought was really funny in Mason and Dixon was that they basically portray George Washington as a huge pothead, and Martha Washington is coming out with big trays of cookies in case anybody has the munchies. Obviously, this was a fictitious book. It is not actually real. Domestic hemp growers didn't really know that much about the psychoactive properties of smoking it. They mostly just used it for things like rope and fiber. Basically, the social practice of smoking cannabis and marijuana didn't really come into play until Mexican immigrants basically brought it into the United States. And basically that use ultimately spread outward from points of origin, areas like New Orleans and other border areas. And ultimately, marijuana use spread from there. And as we kind of talked about with policy changes, oftentimes what we are going to discover is that if use is exploding unchecked, or if there's the perception of that danger, that's when the government is going to intervene. And this was certainly the case in the 1930s. The U.S. Bureau of Narcotics ultimately portrayed this as this horrifying menace, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit. In particular, the passage of 1937's Marijuana Tax Act. This was ultimately overturned in 1969, but as we have seen in the past 60 years, it is still tightly controlled. So I want to talk a little bit about Henry Anslinger, who is part of the reason that marijuana was framed as the menace that it was. Basically, in some congressional hearings, he testified as follows. Those who are habitually accustomed to use of the drug marijuana are said to develop a delirious rage after its administration, during which they are temporarily, at least, irresponsible and liable to commit violent crimes. The prolonged use of this narcotic is said to produce mental deterioration. It apparently releases inhibitions of an antisocial nature which dwell within the individual. He was basically the first commissioner of narcotics in the Bureau of Narcotics of the U.S. Treasury. Additionally, information was being fed to the popular press and the media about why marijuana use was bad, including articles with these following names: Marijuana, Assassin of Youth, Sex Crazing Drug Menace, and of course, Reefer Madness. Now, to also be clear, part of the reason for this is partially because they needed something to basically be a new target, and additionally, there's some racism here as well. So I pulled this from CBS News. This was written in November 17th, 2016. If you look for the roots of America's ban on cannabis, you'll find nearly all roads lead to a man named Harry Anslinger. I said Henry, my apologies. He was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which laid the groundwork for the modern DEA. He was appointed in 1930, just as the prohibition of alcohol was beginning to crumble, and he remained in power for 32 years. Early on, he was on record essentially saying cannabis use was no big deal. He called the idea that it made people mad or violent an absurd fallacy. But when he was put in charge of the FBN, he changed his position. So there's a book called Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. From the moment he took charge of the Bureau, so this is a book that comes from Johann Hari, Harry was aware of the weakness of his new position. A war on narcotics alone, cocaine and heroin, outlawed in 1914, remember that's the Harrison Act, wasn't enough. They were only used by a tiny minority, and you couldn't keep an entire department alive on such small crumbs. He needed more. As a result, he made it his mission to rid the U.S. of all drugs, including cannabis. In particular, he latched onto the story of a young man named Victor Licata who hacked his family to death with an axe, supposedly while high on cannabis. It was discovered many years later that Licata had a history of mental illnesses in his family, and there was no proof he ever used the drug. There was little scientific evidence to support Anslinger's claims. He contacted 30 scientists, and 29 told him cannabis was not a dangerous thing. But it was the theory of the single expert who agreed with him that he presented to the public. Now, as I kind of mentioned, there is a racial component here as well. And as we continue to talk about marijuana in particular, there is again going to be a racial component, not just in the 1930s, but additionally in Nixon's war on drugs. He claimed that Black people and Latinas were the primary users of marijuana, and it made them forget their place in the fabric of American society. He even went so far to argue that jazz musicians were creating satanic music, all thanks to the influence of pot. This obsession eventually led to a sort of witch hunt against Billie Holiday, who struggled with heroin addiction, and she lost her license to perform in New York cabarets as a result. He claimed that cannabis promoted interracial mixing and interracial relationships. And as we kind of talked about, the fact that we call it marijuana is part of that. It was commonly called cannabis, but because it had been brought into the United States by Mexican immigrants, tying it to people who were Mexican made it very negative. So you can kind of see why, especially later on, you continue to see this demonization of cannabis, partially because of Anslinger's actions, and additionally, the racism continued to ramp up based on the war on drugs. So before we move on, I do want to talk a little bit about Nixon's war on drugs, particularly with marijuana. So again, kind of showing you a quote. This is not from Harry Anslinger. This is from John Ehrlichman. This was a quote that was made in the 90s, and he was a part of Nixon's group as the war on drugs was passed. You want to know what this war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So you can actually find this quote. It is real. It is legit. Part of the reason that the war on drugs exists is because of the actions that the Nixon administration took against people that he considered enemies. And of course, racism. So now let's move on to talk about the basic pharmacology of marijuana or cannabis. So THC, so delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, is the active ingredient in marijuana. It was discovered in 1964, and and this was discovered by two Israeli researchers named Gaoni and Mekulam, and along with some of the oftentimes as we kind of talked about, there are other cannabinoids that are in the plant, but generally they're not thought to really contribute to the psychoactive properties. So one of the things that we find is that burning marijuana will cause THC to vaporize. Typically, one joint is going to have about 0.5 to about 1 gram of cannabis. And if the content of THC is about 4%, a 1 gram joint is going to contain about 40 milligrams of active ingredient. So this is going to enter the lungs in small particles. Only about maybe 20 to 30% of the original THC content is going to be absorbed into the lungs, though. And this is partially because the amount that is absorbed is affected by different things. First of all, it's affected by the initial amount of plant material that you have. Also by the pattern of smoking itself. So the amount, the potency of the plant, is it sensimilla, is it not? And additionally, different types of patterns of smoking. So puff volume, puff frequency, breath hold duration, etc. So here you can actually see the chemical structure of THC. And now let's talk about how it's absorbed and then eventually metabolized. So as I kind of mentioned, particularly with smoking, THC is going to be very easily absorbed into the lungs, and blood levels are going to ultimately rise quickly. After kind of that peak, THC concentrations begin to decline as the liver begins to metabolize them. Now, oral consumption is going to be a little bit different. So if you're having like a Toke House cookie or like a lazy or a pot brownie or something like that, it's going to be a little bit different. There's going to be prolonged absorption, but it's going to be pretty poor, and thus it's going to be very low plasma levels, and they're going to vary. And this is largely because of that first pass metabolism that happens in the liver after the stomach has basically passed those contents. So elimination from the body, this is one of the things that's a little bit different from some of the other drugs that we've talked about. Elimination from the body is really going to be complicated. So as you can kind of see here, you can see time since taking a drug, and as you can see, you get very rapid THC concentration, but eventually those blood levels are going to decline. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the other slide that I forgot to mention here is that when the liver metabolizes THC, one of the things that we do find is that it is stored in drug depots, particularly in body fat. Remember that drug depots take all comers. And so THC is going to basically be stored in those depots. And remember that those depots will not release their contents until those blood levels drop. So ultimately what you're going to see, we get that blood level drop, and boom, here come the depots basically releasing their contents. So you don't have complete elimination right away until those depots are cleared. Notice that we don't really return to kind of level 0 until about 9 hours, even though it looks like we're getting there at 2 hours. So complete elimination is often going to be slower due to those deposits in those drug depots and body fat. And here's what's critical. Even after that clearance, one of the things that we do know, the elimination rate of THC, the half-life of THC is actually estimated to be about 20 to 30 hours. So that basically means with 3 half-lives, you don't have complete elimination until 90 hours. That is several days, and we do actually find that it can be detected in a urine test more than 2 weeks after a single use. That will not necessarily be the case with other drugs, but it is certainly true with marijuana. So keep that in mind if you are going to get hired somewhere that drug tests. So now let's talk a little bit about the different mechanisms of action. So there are 2 different types of cannabinoid receptors. These were originally discovered in 1988. And it turns out that we have 2 different types. So we have what are called CB1, and then we have CB2. The one that is in the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, those are going to be our CB1 receptors. CB2 is largely going to be found in areas like your immune system, bone tissue, adipose tissue, better known as fat cells, and the gastrointestinal tract. Additionally, you can actually find CB2 receptors in the microglia, especially in cases where inflammation of the brain is occurring. So here you can actually see the location of some of those cannabinoid receptors. Yellow is where we're going to find the largest concentration, followed by orange, and then red, followed by blue. And you can see that some of the greatest concentrations of cannabinoid receptors largely are going to be in areas like the globus pallidus of the basal ganglia, the substantia nigra of the midbrain near the ventral tegmental area, and to a lesser extent, we have areas like parts of the cortex, areas like the caudate, so again, the basal ganglia is getting involved, the hippocampus, and parts of the cerebellum. Okay, So cannabinoid receptors, we're not really going to talk about them very much, but what you do need to know is that they are metabotropic in nature. They are not ionotropic. They exert a wide variety of cellular effects, and they tend to be slower acting than ionotropic receptors. So basically, they couple to G proteins, and they inhibit cyclic AMP. They also inhibit calcium channels, voltage sensitive calcium channels, and they open potassium channels. So largely, you see a lot of inhibition going on. So one of the things we see is if you inhibit calcium, you're not going to get as many cellular effects. If you open potassium channels, those lead to inhibitory effects. And so as a result, you can kind of see that cannabinoids tend to be pretty inhibitory in nature. So what is the role of the cannabinoid receptor? So one of the things that we know is that THC is a partial agonist. It is not a perfect agonist, but it is in fact a partial agonist. So it's not actually a full receptor agonist. And that's partially because researchers have found that there are synthetic cannabinoid compounds that they've made that actually work better on cannabinoid receptors than THC. And researchers have found that when it is applied to mice, you're going to see things like reduced movement to the point of catalepsy, where they just really don't move for a while, hypothermia, which basically means lowering of body temperature, and hypoalgesia, which is a dampening of the pain response. So a couple of other things that researchers have found is that CB1 seems to play a role with memory, and CB2 seems to affect the immune system. So researchers have found that cannabinoids do actually hurt performance on animal memory tests. So what you're looking at is data from a radial arm maze. And I recognize that only 2 of you have actually had biopsych with me last semester, so you may not know what the radial arm maze is. Basically, the idea behind a radial arm maze is that a rat is put in the center of this maze that has a bunch of arms extending out from the center. The goal of the task is for the rat to visit each of the arms that contains food and not necessarily to revisit the same arm that they've already been to. So it's kind of a working memory task. You need to keep track of where you've been, and you also need to keep track of where else you need to go. And so what you're looking at are rats that have been injected with the following. So they have either been injected with a vehicle, which is basically just sterile saline, and you can see that they're doing training, but then they also get a vehicle. And you can see that there's not really a lot of errors that are being made between training and test. Now, here, this group of rats was injected during training with a cannabinoid agonist or cannabinoid antagonist, a CB1 antagonist known as rimonabant. It's also known, and this is a mouthful, y'all, it's also known as SR141716A. We're just going to go ahead and call it rimonabant. So basically, it's going to counteract any effect of cannabinoids. And as you can see, again, basically, if you get rimonabant and then you get a vehicle, you don't really get a lot of change between training and test. You're not making a lot of mistakes. Here, you have a group that gets a vehicle at training, but at test, they get some type of cannabinoid in this case. And in this case, as you can see, there are a lot more working memory errors here. The rats are making more mistakes. They're revisiting arms of the maze that they've already been to. Now, here's what's really critical. During training, this group of rats gets rimonabant, and then during test, they get the cannabinoids. So these should counteract each other. And you can see that the group that gets the antagonist at training and cannabinoids at test, they look a lot more like our control group than our group that got cannabinoids. And it's been suggested that what's happening, particularly in the hippocampus, is that you are getting a reduction of long-term potentiation, which is the kind of the underlying cellular basis of all learning and memory. So in addition to seeing worse performance on the radial arm maze, they've seen this with a lot of other spatial memory tasks with rats, including the Morris water maze, where rats have to remember where a hidden platform is as they swim around a pool, and other types of memory tests. So it seems like this is a problem for memory. Now, on the other hand, agonists at CB2 receptors, so things that enhance cannabinoids, they've actually found that this affects cytokines, and additionally, different types of inflammatory responses. So again, we're kind of thinking that CB1 is more involved in memory, CB2 is more for the immune system. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. And this is kind of what we talked about when we talked about opioids last week. If we have opioid receptors, that must mean that we make some sort of endogenous opioid. We have also found that we have cannabinoid receptors. As a result, we should have endogenous cannabinoids. And it turns out that we actually do. We have what are called endocannabinoids, and we have two different versions. We have what is called anandamide, and part of the reason that it got the name anandamide is because that comes from the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning bringer of inner bliss and tranquility. And then here you have the other one, 2-AG. So these are endocannabinoids. They are also known as retrograde messengers. That means that they go from postsynaptic cells to presynaptic cells to basically modify different types of effects. So they actually move backwards to exert different types of cellular effects. And how it is synthesized and released is based on how many depolarizations the cells have had, how much calcium influx there is. But what's really kind of critical for you to know is that these endocannabinoids seem to be really critical for pain perception. And one of the other things that we have found, in addition to affecting pain perception, is that they influence food intake. So what you're kind of looking at here are some data kind of looking at food intake and body weight gain in a group of rats. So you're looking at rats that were either given a vehicle, a dose of 5 milligrams per kilogram of AM6545, which is an CB1 receptor antagonist, and then 10 milligrams per kilogram of AM6545. So treatment, as you can kind of see, is that initially you actually see with those receptor antagonists, so we're not getting a lot of endocannabinoid release, what ends up happening is a reduction in food intake compared to controls. So you can see here the vehicle group is taking significantly more food intake than either groups that get those doses of that receptor antagonist. That is also true 3 hours later, but it's starting to wear off about 5 hours later. And here you can see food intake over time between the two groups. Again, The group that's given the vehicle, they have pretty stable amounts of food intake. The group that is getting the receptor antagonist at 10 milligrams per kilogram, remember that fewer endocannabinoids are going to be released. And as a result, we have a very stable reduction of food intake during that period. You can also see the weight change. Here's the group with the vehicle. Here's the group that is not getting those endocannabinoids because of the application of this antagonist. So it does seem like activation of the CB1 receptor may enhance food intake. When that receptor is blocked, food intake reduces. Additionally, endocannabinoids do also influence memory performance. So what you're looking at in this particular image is a rat doing a conditioning task. So here they are presented with a tone. So this is a very standard classical conditioning, a fear conditioning task. A rat is put into a chamber with an electrified floor. Prior to receiving a small foot shock, a tone is presented. So our tone is kind of functioning as our conditioned stimulus that is letting the rat know that that foot shock is about to appear. So what you can kind of see here, that tone is presented for 60 seconds before the foot shock, and you can see over a period of several days that wild type mice, so standard normal mice that aren't really having any modifications to their cannabinoid receptors, you can see over time that as they are repeatedly exposed to this over time, after that initial presentation, they show extinction. So here you can kind of see here's, and when it's presented on its own, you get that extinction. Notice that when you lack the CB1 receptor, and thus you're not really producing those endocannabinoids, you don't really get that extinction response. You still get a high rate of freezing even when the tone is presented on its own with no foot shock. So now let's talk about the effects of cannabinoids on human beings. So the subjective effects that people feel, this can basically be broken down into 4 different stages. So first of all, you have what is called the buzz. This is a really short period of time where the user is going to feel lightheaded, they might feel a little dizzy, and then they have the high. This is going to be characterized by a lot of feelings of euphoria, exhilaration, disinhibition, which is often going to show up as increased laughter, thinking a variety of different things are funny. If you've taken a larger amount of marijuana, eventually this will progress to what we call getting stoned. This is usually going to be a really calm, relaxed state, maybe even a little dreamlike. In fact, some people do report some changes in their sensory reactions. They may feel like they're floating, their visual or auditory perception may be enhanced, maybe visual illusions, and they'll feel like time is slowing down. And then finally, you get the come down. Basically, these effects are going to stop. That's going to really vary based on the dose of THC that's been taken and one's own personal rate of drug metabolism. Now, what about, so that's kind of the subjective effects, but what are some of the different physiological responses? So one of the things that we know is that there is increased blood flow to the skin. That's going to lead to sensations of warmth or even flushing. You're going to stimulate heart rate, which may kind of feel like a pounding pulse. Additionally, we do know that marijuana, as we kind of talked about with the endocannabinoids, are kind of critical for processing hunger. So a lot of people who take marijuana are going to have an increased appetite, aka the munchies. This has been documented both in human beings and in lab rats. In fact, it's that increase in hunger rate that's actually one of the major recognized therapeutic uses for marijuana. People who are undergoing cancer treatment, particularly chemo, don't always have the appetite that they need, and they need to eat food and get nourishment to be healthy. And so medical marijuana can be used to stimulate that appetite. So here you can kind of see a maximum mean rating of drug effect. Here we have our subjective effects. We have feeling high and then feeling stoned. Here we have somebody with a placebo plus marijuana. And then we have a group that got rimonabant and marijuana. Remember that rimonabant is basically an antagonist of the CB1 receptor. So basically, you are going to get kind of a control, like they're going to counteract each other. And you can see the group that has the placebo initially, but then marijuana, they have more of a high sensation, and they're also more likely to feel stoned. They also tend to have a larger increase in heart rate compared to people who are taking marijuana, but with an antagonist to counteract it. And a lot of these effects are going to be mediated by those CB1 receptors. Now, you can get more intense effects. You can have very short-lived psychotic symptoms like depersonalization, basically feeling like you're separated from yourself, derealization, which is feeling like the world around you is unreal. You might feel agitated, and you might even feel some paranoia. And this is affected by dosage and prior use. One of the things that we do find is that first-time users are more likely to experience adverse reactions, but people who use pretty regularly can have this happen if they're taking a higher dose. Flashbacks have actually been reported in people who take marijuana sometimes, even though you typically only really hear about that with hallucinogens like LSD. One of the things that's kind of interesting, you can actually get placebo effects for marijuana. Researchers back in 1998 gave participants capsules that either contain THC or a placebo. They were basically told that the capsules would either have a placebo or different psychoactive compounds like cannabinoids. And basically, the expectation of consuming cannabinoids enhanced the effects of actual cannabinoids, but it elicited a more positive reaction from people who were getting the placebo. So you can get a placebo effect for marijuana. Now, one of the things that we do find is that in general, you don't usually hear about people doing intravenous THC administration, but researchers have kind of found that blood levels do tend to peak more rapidly with IV administration than compared to either smoking or oral administration. So people who are smoking don't really reach that peak until after the cigarette has been finished. And that's especially true for oral administration as well. You're going to get a peak usually 30 minutes to an hour after you have ingested. Now, for human beings, one of the things that we do know is that marijuana negatively affects cognition, and it also affects motor skills. So particularly, we find that it affects verbal and spatial processing. So basically, what you're looking at here, you are having a group that is either given a placebo or different dosages of THC in an explicit memory task. So they basically had to recall a passage of prose, and then they were tested on it basically 45 minutes later. Testing occurred 1 hour before the drug or placebo administration, and then again 2 hours after they got the placebo or THC, and again at 6 hours. And what you can see is that all of the groups that are in this explicit memory task, where they have to listen to a story of prose and then recall it, you can kind of see that The groups are pretty equivalent, but notice what happens 2 hours after either receiving a placebo or receiving THC. The group that gets a placebo actually has their performance improve. You can see that there's not really much of a change from baseline for the group that got the lower dose of THC, but the group that got the larger dose, they just tank out. And that poor performance is maintained 6 hours later, whereas the group that got the lower dose of THC and the placebo, in general, we don't expect memory for those things to be better 6 hours later, but you can see that the group that's getting the higher dose of THC is considerably worse in their explicit memory performance. In addition to this, people who take marijuana may experience some temporary slower reaction time and some time estimation problems. We know that time slows down subjectively for people who do this. In addition to this, we do find that this will affect all stages of memory formation. So it ultimately affects that conversion from short-term memory into long-term memory. And as we can kind of see here with the differing levels of performance, this is dose dependent in nature. Now, what happens with cognition with more frequent use? We do find that heavy use hurts executive functioning, like things like planning, organizing, monitoring attention, engaging in selective attention, and this can ultimately last for several weeks. Additionally, more frequent use, people may experience things like decision-making issues and planning behavior problems. It's a lot harder for them to do and engage in these executive functions. Now, one of the things that we do find is that marijuana is incredibly reinforcing, which is really surprising to people. There are people who believe that marijuana is not addictive and that marijuana is not reinforcing in nature. That's not actually true. Regular users can actually tell the difference based on their subjective experiences. They can tell the difference between THC compared to a placebo. And regular users do tend to prefer higher content. We also know that animals will self-administer THC to a stable point, indicating that the drug is highly reinforcing. So what you're looking at here is self-administration with squirrel monkeys. Basically, you can kind of see they were originally trained on a schedule that was using cocaine, but then they were switched to saline. So they were originally trained on cocaine, but now they get saline, and you can see that their injections by bar pressing, you can see that that drops. But then when THC was substituted in place of saline, you can see that lever pressing increased to basically deliver about 30 injections per a 1 hour session. Again, when that vehicle comes in, that's basically saline, that drops off, but when THC comes back again, you can see that that's a pretty reinforcing effect. And remember, these monkeys were trained on cocaine administration. So here you can see that THC clearly has some reinforcing properties. So what brain mechanisms make THC so reinforcing? Well, we know there are a couple of things. As you kind of saw, there are a lot of CB1 receptors in areas like the substantia nigra. And we do find that cannabinoids do, in fact, stimulate the mesolimbic pathway. They stimulate firing of dopaminergic neurons in the ventral tegmental area, and as a result, increase dopamine release onto the nucleus accumbens. So again, that's how we're getting those reinforcing effects. In addition to this, we know that the endocannabinoids may also play a role. They actually will interact with other systems that are associated with different types of drugs. So that includes things like cocaine and opioids as well. So now let's move on to talking about cannabis use and abuse. So One of the things that we know about cannabis use, generally, initial marijuana use typically begins in adolescence or young adulthood. And as we kind of talked about with illicit drugs previously, most of the time use is going to peak in young adulthood. Generally, if you haven't tried marijuana by your mid 20s, you are very unlikely to begin at a later time. Not saying it doesn't happen, but it's very uncommon. One of the things that we do find, because most people begin in adolescence, this is part of the reason why there's this idea that marijuana is a gateway drug. And if you grew up like I did with things like the Just Say No campaign or the DARE program, you would often hear that marijuana is a gateway drug. Generally, most adolescents that try marijuana have previous experience with things like alcohol or cigarettes, and then they go to marijuana. And then there's this idea that basically once you do marijuana, you're going to do other things as a result. Now, while that may be true for some people, they try marijuana and they feel like they need harder stuff, it's really hard to actually substantiate whether or not that hypothesis is actually true. It's possible that certain users are already kind of predisposed to seeking out harder stuff because they're curious. But generally what we find is that most people only use marijuana and they do not go on to continue with other types of drugs. Now, there are some different risk factors that we know will lead to a greater likelihood of heavy use. And those include a few of the following. This includes things like emotional problems, particularly with family members, heavy drug use in your family or by your peers, not liking school, poor school performance, and a very early age of first use of marijuana. One of the things that we do find is that rates of marijuana use do tend to be lower from stable families that have closer supervision, people that have strong career aspirations or are assuming parental responsibilities or marriage responsibilities. And one other major factor that plays a role is the degree to which somebody has a good positive experience to early use of cannabis. And generally, researchers have found that people who had more positive responses to their early experiences were at greater risk of developing a dependence than people that didn't have those really positive responses. And you can kind of see here there are some different trajectories of different users. So here we kind of have these different time periods. So basically, these people were recruited for just a longitudinal study when they were about 6 years old. And then they had some follow-up periods. So generally, at follow-up at time 2, most of them were about 14. By time 3, most of them were about 16. By time 4, most of them were about 22. By time 5, most of them were about 27. By time 6, most of them were about 36. And then time 7, actually time 7's 36. Time 5 is about 27, this is about 32, and this is about 36. So you can kind of see here, this is adolescence, this is early adulthood, and then we have kind of that later young adulthood beginning into middle age. And you can kind of see that there are a variety of different type of people here. So here you can see people who are not users or experimenters. You can kind of see that for a lot of the non-users or experimenters, there's an early peak kind of in young adulthood. very low though, and it kind of drops later on. Here we have occasional users in purple. You can kind of see they start out low. Most of them tend to start in young adulthood, and then they kind of drop down lower. We have quitters. These folks started in adolescence and then later quit, or decreasers. We have chronic users. These are people who started in adolescence. They don't use as much as they did in adolescence, but you can see that they're still using more than the other groups. And then we have increasing users. Most of these folks started in young adulthood rather than adolescence, but you can kind of see that even through their 30s, they are increasing their use above and beyond their 20s. So you can see that there are different types of users and there are different types of trajectories from adolescence to adulthood for each of these different groups. You can actually develop a tolerance to cannabinoids. Researchers have found that animals that were given THC do eventually display a tolerance to the behavioral and the physical effects. And this is largely due to the desensitization and that down regulation of cannabinoid receptors. So here you can actually kind of see the desensitization for different types of cannabinoid receptors over time. And what I really kind of want to impress upon you is that generally you're getting a reduction in receptor density and G protein activation over time. So here was a control group. Here's a group with all the way to 21 days of THC, and you can see that there is significantly less receptor activity, particularly in the basal ganglia and the cerebellum compared to controls. Now, dependence, for those who take it, is ultimately going to be based on one's pattern of use. If you don't use it all that often, you're not necessarily going to develop a dependence. People who progress to daily use, they have about a 50% chance of becoming dependent. And overall, 10% of individuals who ever used cannabis will eventually become dependent. Now, what does it mean to actually be dependent? So again, you want to stop, but you have difficulty doing so. You may experience cravings, and you may experience some different types of withdrawal effects. This includes things like irritability, increased anxiety, depressed mood, sleep problems, extra aggressiveness, and decreased appetite, all of which are opposite effects of what cannabis does. So, like I said, you're going to have things like irritability, anxiety, depressed mood, sleep disturbances, and typically if you are a heavy user, those will tend to be a bit worse. So we have a group of current marijuana users that were compared with ex-users, and you can kind of see that for the current users, after up to 3 weeks of abstinence, particularly, this is their baseline data, but you can kind of see that especially for that first week, those withdrawal symptoms compared to ex-users are very significantly different. Now, most people are not going to seek treatment for cannabis abuse. Generally, if outpatient treatment is sought, it's usually going to be one of the following. It's either going to be cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe refocus your thoughts so that you're not using marijuana as a coping response, relapse prevention training, as well as motivational therapy. So what you're actually kind of looking at here, you are looking at motivational enhancement in this figure, along with cognitive behavioral therapy. You are also looking at contingency management, which we previously talked about with respect to cocaine abuse. So the idea behind contingency management is that we're trying to basically change reinforcement to be something that happens when you have less drug in your system. And you can see that generally, Case management is at the very bottom, and this is kind of our baseline. And it seems like out of all of the groups, you can see that relapse is pretty common. The proportion of people who aren't relapse drops over time, but it seems like contingency management, despite having some relapse, is still pretty effective here. Now, what are some of the long-term effects of chronic use? One of the major things that we know is that there's an inverse relationship between using cannabis and your educational performance. So the more that you use, the worse your grades get, the worse your negative attitudes about grades are, or about school are, and the greater absenteeism that you have. It's also a risk factor for poor performance in school and for dropping out. Now, to keep this in mind, these are correlational relationships. They are not causal relationships. These could occur because of cognitive deficits, but remember, bidirectionality with correlations is possible. So it's possible that maybe people who don't do well in school ultimately end up preferring cannabis and use it more as a mechanism to cope with their school difficulties rather than cannabis causing those problems. Another thing that we know about that can be an issue is what is called amotivational syndrome. Research going back more than about 30 years or so has found evidence for apathy, aimlessness, loss of achievement motivation, lack of long-term planning, and decreased productivity in people who are chronic users as well. Now, again, this could be a cause of why people seek out marijuana rather than a consequence. So again, it could be another bidirectionality thing. Now, from a neuropsychological issue, we know that there are potential brain abnormalities, alterations in temporal lobe structures like the hippocampus, although it's kind of iffy. Some researchers have found abnormalities in areas like the anterior cingulate cortex. Additionally, there is lung damage. So one of the things that I was going to mention is that lung damage is very possible because of the high smoking amount. Marijuana joints contain less different psychoactive ingredients than tobacco cigarettes do, but the smoke that's produced has the same kind of irritants. They have the same type of carcinogens, and actually tar from cannabis smoke actually has a higher concentration of those carcinogens. So again, there is potentially a lung cancer risk there. There are also potential reproductive issues, both in male and female people who are born AFAB or AMAP. And this could potentially affect sperm motility, sperm count, testosterone levels, and animal studies have found that THC suppresses luteinizing hormone, which is secreted by the pituitary gland. This could lead to things like potential pregnancy failure, delayed embryonic development, and possibly fetal death. But this has only been found in animals. This hasn't necessarily been found in humans. Now, I want to briefly talk about K2. So basically, beginning around 2004, remember that in the United States, marijuana is still, at least for right now, considered a Schedule I drug. As we've talked about previously on our forums, there is a move to make it Schedule III. So again, when you make something very hard to access, you're usually going to find some black market workarounds or things like that. So around 2004, you get to hear about substances called K2 or spice or things like that. These synthetic cannabinoids contain CB1 agonists, and they started being sold on the internet 20 years ago. So it was kind of a way to get a legal high, similarly to how people did that with bath salts for amphetamines. Now, these produce a lot of negative physiological and psychological effects. And again, because they contain CB1 agonists and they tend to be a little bit more concentrated and they're more powerful, there's a greater likelihood of dependency. And basically, the DEA put these synthetic cannabinoids under a Schedule 1 or under Schedule 1. So folks, this is all I had for talking about the cannabinoids. We will talk about hallucinogens next time.